This billionaire thought his maid was stealing from him, until he followed her one night and discovered a secret that left him speechless. The city was asleep, but the lights on the top floor of the glass tower were still burning. Inside the penthouse office, a man who owned half the skyline sat alone in silence. Marcus Hawley, billionaire, business legend, the man newspapers called ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable. For decades he had built an empire that stretched across continents. Steel, technology, logistics, finance, every industry seemed to bend to his will. Politicians sought his approval. Investors chased his favor. But tonight, Marcus Hawley wasn't studying markets or negotiating billion-dollar deals. He was staring at a security monitor. The screen flickered in the darkness, showing the quiet hallway of his mansion. Timestamp: 12:03 a.m. The camera captured the slow creak of a side door opening, and then she appeared. An elderly woman stepped cautiously into the hallway, her thin shoulders wrapped in a worn gray coat. Mrs. Alvarez, his housemaid. She had worked in the mansion for years. Always quiet, always polite, the kind of employee people rarely noticed. Or she cleaned rooms before sunrise, prepared meals, no one thanked her for, disappeared before the guests arrived. Invisible. But tonight, something about the footage stopped Marcus cold. Mrs. Alvarez looked around nervously before slipping out the back entrance. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. He rewound the footage, played it again, and again. She left the mansion at midnight, alone. The next clip showed her walking down the long driveway, disappearing beyond the iron gates. Marcus frowned. Why would a woman her age leave the house in the middle of the night? At first his mind jumped to the obvious: theft. Maybe she was sneaking out to sell something she had taken from the house, or meeting someone, maybe even working secretly for a competitor. In Marcus Hale's world, loyalty was a currency and betrayal was common. He opened the archives, scrolled through the previous nights. What he found made his expression harden. She did it every night. 12:02 a.m., 12:01 a.m., 12:03 a.m. Always the same routine, always the same direction. Marcos leaned back slowly. His empire had been built on noticing patterns others ignored, and this pattern bothered him. But there was something else, something he couldn't explain. As the footage played again, the camera zoomed slightly on her face beneath the porch light. Mrs. Alvarez looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, her hands trembled as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. She didn't look like someone sneaking away for profit. She looked like someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Marcus paused the video. For a long moment, he simply stared at the frozen image. A strange feeling crept into his chest. Not anger, not suspicion, something closer to curiosity. The next night, Marcus didn't watch the cameras. He waited. 11:55 p.m. The mansion was silent. At exactly midnight, the back door opened again. Mrs. Alvarez stepped outside. And this time, Marcus was already watching from the shadows near the garage. For the first time in years, the billionaire did something completely unexpected. He grabbed his own car keys. No driver, no security team. No assistants, just him. He slid into the driver's seat of a black sedan and started the engine quietly. Up ahead, Mrs. Alvarez walked slowly down the dark street beyond the gates. Marcus kept his distance, headlights dimmed. Curiosity had become suspicion, and suspicion had now become a decision. He would follow her. What Marcus Hawley didn't know in that moment was that this quiet midnight walk would lead him somewhere he never expected, somewhere that would shatter everything he believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the invisible people who serve the powerful. Because when Mrs. Alvarez finally reached her destination that night, Marcus felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. The glowing sign above the building made his heart sink. Hospital. Her name was Elena Alvarez. In the mansion, almost no one used it. To most people, she was simply the maid, the quiet woman who appeared before sunrise and vanished before anyone important noticed she had been there at all. For nearly 8 years, Elena had worked inside Marcus Hale's enormous home. She polished marble floors that reflected chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. She folded silk napkins for dinner parties where powerful guests debated markets, politics, and power. She carried trays past rooms filled with laughter, champagne, and conversations about billion-dollar deals. But no one ever asked about her life. Marcus Hawley remained in the hallway, half hidden behind a row of plastic chairs, watching as Elena Alvarez slowly followed the nurse down a narrow corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above them. The deeper they walked into the hospital, the quieter everything became. Emergency rooms faded behind closed doors. The hurried voices of doctors disappeared soon. There was only the distant hum of machines and the low murmur of nurses speaking in careful whispers. Elena stopped in front of a glass door. The sign beside it read, "Intensive Care Unit." She hesitated for a moment, as if preparing herself. Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Marcus moved closer, careful not to draw attention. Through the glass panel he saw her approach, a small hospital bed near the far wall, and that was when he saw the child. A young boy lay beneath white blankets, So still he almost looked asleep, but the machines beside him told a different story. Thin tubes ran into his arms, monitors blinked quietly, tracking the fragile rhythm of his heart. An oxygen mask covered half his face. He looked impossibly small in that hospital bed, barely 10 years old. Marcus felt his chest tighten as Alina pulled a chair beside the bed and slowly sat down. For a long moment she simply watched the boy, her tired eyes studying his face as if memorizing every detail. Then she reached out and gently took his hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely more than a whisper. "Grandma is here." The boy stirred faintly. No one wondered where she went when the night ended. No one noticed the way she rubbed her tired hands when she thought no one was looking. Inside the mansion, Elena moved like a ghost, efficient, quiet, invisible, and in a place ruled by wealth and status. Invisibility was easy for someone like her, but outside the iron gates, Elena Alvarez lived a life that none of them could imagine. Marcus watched from his car as she continued walking through the quiet streets. The further she went, the more the city changed. The glowing towers disappeared behind him. The streets grew darker. The stores closed. Streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks and aging apartment building. Elena walked slowly, but with determination, her small frame leaning slightly forward as if pushing through the cold wind. Marcus kept his distance. His expensive sedan felt strangely out of place in these neighborhoods. But Elena didn't stop. She crossed blocks, turned corners, walked past shuttered laundromats and empty bus stops. Rain began to fall lightly, tapping against the windshield. Still, she didn't slow down. Marcus felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts. Confusion. Why would a woman who spent all day working in his mansion choose to walk miles across the city in the middle of the night? Finally, Elena reached a narrow apartment building. The paint was peeling. The lights inside flickered weakly. Marcus watched as she climbed the front steps slowly, unlocking the door with a small key. The window of her apartment glowed faintly for only a few minutes. Then the light turned off again. Marcus frowned. Had he been wrong? Maybe she really had just gone home. But 15 minutes later the door opened again. Elena stepped back onto the street. This time she pulled her coat tighter around herself and began walking again. Marcus felt his chest tighten. She had just returned home from a long shift cleaning his mansion. Most people would collapse into bed, but Elena kept walking. Through the rain, through the cold, through streets that grew quieter with every block. Minutes later, the answer appeared in front of him. A large concrete building stood under harsh fluorescent lights. Ambulances were parked outside. Red emergency signs glowed through the rain. A hospital. Marcus straightened in his seat. Now curiosity turned into something deeper. Concerned, Elena hurried across the wet pavement and pushed through the sliding doors of the emergency entrance. Marcus hesitated only a moment before stepping out of his car and following at a distance. Inside, the hospital smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion. Nurses moved quickly through crowded hallways. Machines beeped softly behind closed doors. Elena approached the reception desk, removing her wet coat as she spoke to the nurse behind the counter. Marcus stayed just far enough away to remain unnoticed, but the hospital was quiet enough that voices carried. The nurse recognized her immediately. Her expression softened with a mixture of sympathy and worry. "You're back again," the nurse said gently. Elena nodded, her hands twisting nervously together.
Yes.
"I came as soon as my shift ended." Lena sighed. "Elena, you know the situation. The bills are already too high." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Elena lowered her eyes to the floor. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her coat. For a moment she said nothing. Then her voice came out quiet and fragile. "I know." The nurse leaned forward with concern. "You can't keep doing this alone." Elena swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly against the counter. Marcus watched her shoulders rise and fall as she took a slow breath, and then she said something that made him freeze where he stood. "Please," she whispered, "just let me see him tonight." Because the reason Elena Alvarez came to that hospital every night had nothing to do with herself. His eyelids fluttered open just enough to recognize her. A weak smile touched his face. "Elena, you came." "Of course I came," she said softly, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "I promised I would never leave you." Marcus stood, frozen in the hallway. "Grandma." The word echoed in his mind. A nurse walked past him carrying a clipboard, speaking quietly with a doctor near the doorway. Marcus wasn't trying to listen, but the hospital was too. Quiet, every word carried. "The condition hasn't improved," the doctor said under his breath. "The heart defect is getting worse." The nurse sighed. "Has anyone told the grandmother yet?" "We tried," the doctor replied. "But the surgery is expensive. $300,000 at minimum." Marcus felt the number hit him like a dull thud. $300,000. Two, and it was a rounding error in a quarterly report. To someone like Elena Alvarez, it might as well have been $1 million. Inside the ICU room, Elena gently rubbed the boy's hand, speaking softly so only he could hear. "Did you eat dinner tonight?" The boy nodded weakly. "The nurse gave me soup." "Good," she said, though Marcus could hear the strain in her voice. "You need your strength?" He watched her open a small paper bag she had carried inside. From it she removed a plastic container with a few pieces of fruit, probably bought from a street vendor on her walk. "I brought you a favor," she told him, holding up the fruit, like it was a treasure. The boy smiled again, though it clearly took effort. Marcus looked down at his own hands. Just hours earlier, he had been sitting at a dining table covered with food flown in from 3 different countries, and now he was watching a grandmother celebrate a handful of fruit like it was a feast. The contrast unsettled him. Outside the ICU room, the doctor finally stepped inside. Elena stood up immediately. "Dr. Sheen," said nervously. The man offered a sympathetic smile, though his eyes carried the weight of difficult news. "Mrs. Alvarez, we need to talk." Marcus watched through the glass as they moved to the corner of the room. The doctor spoke quietly but clearly. "Your grandson's heart condition is progressing faster than we hoped." Elena's shoulders stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means he needs surgery soon," she swallowed. "How soon?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "Within the next few weeks." Elena's hands began to tremble slightly. "And the cost?" she asked. The doctor looked down at the clipboard. "Approximately $300,000. Silence filled the room. For several seconds, Elena said nothing. Marcus could almost feel the weight of that number pressing down on her. $300,000 more money than she might earn in 20 years. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost impossibly calm. "Thank you for telling me the truth, doctor." The doctor looked surprised. "Mrs. Alvarez, I know this is overwhelming. There may be charities, but the process takes time, I understand," she said quietly. The doctor studied her face and, "Do you have anyone who can help you?" Elena shook her head slowly. "No." Another pause followed. Then she lifted her chin slightly, as if making a decision. "I will find the money somehow." Marcus felt something twist sharply inside his chest, because he knew something Elena Alvarez didn't. There was no way she could ever find that kind of money. Not working in his mansion. Not walking miles every night. Not selling the small belongings she probably owned, and yet she believed she would. Not because it was possible, but because she refused to let that child die. Marcus looked through the glass again at the boy lying in the hospital bed. Then at the exhausted woman standing beside him, and suddenly a terrifying realization settled into his mind. This woman had been carrying this burden every single day, working under his roof, serving his household, struggling silently, and he, Marcus Harley, the man who prided himself on noticing everything, had never seen it. The next morning, the mansion looked exactly the same. Sunlight spilled through towering glass windows. The marble floors shined like mirrors. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases along the long dining table. To anyone else, it was another ordinary morning in the house of Marcus Harley, but something had changed. Marcus stood quietly near the doorway of the dining room, watching. Elena Alvarez moved slowly across the polished floor with a cloth in her hand, wiping the massive oak table that seated 20 guests. Her movements were careful and practiced, the same quiet rhythm she had repeated every day for years. But now Marcus noticed things he had never seen before. Her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Her eyes were swollen and red, the faint traces of a sleepless night impossible to hide. And yet, when another staff member passed by and greeted her, Elena still managed a polite smile. "Good morning." The words were soft, almost cheerful. Marcus felt something heavy settle in his chest. Just hours earlier, he had watched her sitting beside a hospital bed, holding the fragile hand of a child fighting to stay alive. Now she was here again, working, serving, acting as if nothing was wrong. The contrast felt unbearable. Marcus turned away and walked toward his office. For most of his life, he had believed success came from efficiency. Systems, structure, control, but now a question kept echoing in his mind. How could a woman who worked under his roof be suffering like that, without anyone noticing? Inside his office, Marcus opened the employee records. It took only seconds to find Elena Alvarez's file. 8 years of employment, every attendance report, perfect, never late, never absent, never once disciplined. Marcus scrolled slowly through the records. Performance notes described her as reliable, respectful, hard-working, the kind of employee every household wanted. But there was something else. Near the middle of the file, a small entry caught his attention, a request for leave. 2 unpaid days off. Marcus opened the document. The request had been submitted 6 months earlier. He read the reason written in Elena's careful handwriting: family medical emergency. His jaw tightened. Below the request was the manager's response. Denied. Marcus read the explanation again. Household schedule disruption. He stared at the words for a long moment. 6 months ago, that was exactly when the doctor said the boy had first been hospitalized. Elena had asked for just 2 days. 2 days to be with her grandson in the hospital. And someone in Marcus Hale's perfectly organized system had rejected it because it might disrupt the household routine. A cold realization spread through him. His empire ran like a machine. Efficient, profitable, precise. But somewhere along the way, the machine had forgotten something essential. Humanity. Marcus closed the file slowly. That night he found himself driving back to the hospital again. This time he didn't sit in the parking lot. He walked inside. The same sterile smell filled the air. The same quiet hum of machines echoed through the hallways. Marcus moved toward the intensive care unit with steady steps. Through the glass door, he saw Alina sitting beside the boy again, just as she had the night before. Her head was bowed, slightly, her hand gently holding the child's. When she looked up and saw Marcus standing in the doorway, her entire body froze. Shock flashed across her face. She stood up quickly, almost knocking the chair behind her. "Mr. Halley." Her voice trembled. I'm sorry. I didn't know you would be here." She looked down immediately, embarrassment flooding her expression. "I didn't mean to leave the house at night. I always finish my work before I go. I promise it doesn't affect my duties. If I've done something wrong." Marcus raised a hand gently. "Mrs. Alvarez." She fell silent. Fear flickered across her face, the kind of fear that only people without power understand. The fear of losing the one job that keeps everything else from collapsing. "I never wanted to cause trouble," she continued quickly. "If you want me to stop coming here at night, I will. I just needed to see him for a little while after my shift, Mrs. Alvarez." Marcus spoke again, this time more firmly. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the quiet hospital room like something fragile. Elena Alvarez stood beside the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down at the floor. For a moment she didn't answer. Marcus wholly waited. He had asked thousands of questions. In his life, questions that moved Marcus, closed deals, shaped industries. But this one felt different. Finally, Alina spoke. Her voice was soft, careful, almost apologetic. "Because people like you don't usually notice, people like me." Marcus felt the words slant harder than any accusation. She continued, still unable to look directly at him. "You are a very important man, Mr. Hawley. You have a big house, many businesses, many responsibilities." She gestured gently toward the machines beside the boy's bed. "My problems are very small compared to yours." Marcus said nothing. Elena's voice grew even quieter. "And sometimes, when workers bring their problems to powerful people, they lose their jobs." That sentence filled the room with a painful honesty. "I couldn't risk that," she said. "My grandson depends on me." Marcus felt the weight of her words pressing against everything he believed about himself. For the first time in many years, someone had spoken to him without fear of offending him, without trying to impress him, without asking him for anything. And the truth she spoke was simple. She had never asked for help, because she didn't believe anyone like him would care. Realization left him silent. Asterisk. He looked at the boy lying in the hospital bed, the fragile rise and fall of his chest measured by machetes. Then he looked at the woman who had spent months fighting this battle alone, and something inside. Marcus shifted. Not the kind of change that happens in a business meeting, not a calculation, not a strategy, something deeper. The next morning, the hospital accounting department received an unexpected call. A quiet voice confirmed wire transfer $300,000. The full cost of the surgery paid in advance. The administrator asked the obvious question, who should we list as the donor? The answer came calmly. Anonymous. Within hours, the doctors were preparing the operating room. Alina received the news while sitting beside her grandson's bed. At first, she thought there had been a mistake. The nurse repeated the word slowly. "The surgery has been paid for." Elena's hands covered her mouth. "Paid for? By who?" "We were told the donor wishes to remain anonymous." Tears filled her eyes immediately. For the first time in months, hope rushed into the room like sunlight. Days later, the surgery took place. The hospital corridors were tense with waiting. Doctors moved in and out of the operating room while Alina sat quietly in a chair outside, her hands clasped tightly together. Hours passed, and then the doors finally opened. The surgeon stepped forward with a tired smile. The operation was successful. Elena collapsed into tears of relief. Weeks later, the boy slowly opened his eyes in the recovery room. His small voice whispered the first word he recognized, "Grandma." Elena held his hand as if she would never let go again. Across the hallway, Marcus Hawley stood quietly near the window. He had come without reporters, without assistance, without any announcement. For once, he wasn't the billionaire everyone recognized. He was simply a man watching a grandmother and a grandson share a moment that money alone could never create. But the story didn't end inside that hospital. Back at the company, Marcus began making changes. Policies were rewritten. Emergency leave for employees and the families became guaranteed. Medical support funds were created for workers facing impossible bills. And soon after, a new foundation quietly appeared under his company's name. Its purpose was simple: to help the families of workers who faced medical crises they could never afford alone. Inside the mansion, things began to feel different too. Staff members no longer invisible figures, moving silently through hallways. They had names, stories, lives beyond the walls of wealth. And slowly, the story spread. Someone at the hospital mentioned the anonymous Donna. A nurse told a friend, journalist, picked up the thread. Within weeks, the internet was filled with headlines and debates. Millions of people shared the story. Some praised the billionaire for finally seeing what had always been in front of him. Others asked harder questions about wealth, responsibility, and the people who keep powerful lives running quietly in the background. But Marcus Holley rarely responded to the attention, because the real lesson of that night had nothing to do with headlines. It came from a tired grandmother who walked miles through the rain after long days of work, just to hold the hand of a child she refused to abandon. And standing in that hospital hallway, Marcus finally understood something that years of success had never taught him. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage don't come from powerful people. They come from who wants the world, or gets to see. Which leaves one question behind. How many invisible heroes are walking beside us every day, while the world looks the other way?